Hi, welcome to the bathtub, where when you hear this music, you know you're in for a special 200th episode, countdown to the end of the Trump administration episode of, what's it called? In the Footsteps of Astounding, talking about old science fiction and whatever comes to mind. And this is the second episode of our 200th, just to make things confusing. So it's our 200th episode, part 2, and it's now, I think this is 6 days now until we get rid of that idiot. So we're trying to come to a really short one every day until that idiot leaves town. And if it's not 6 days, it's something like that. I'm filming these in clumps. Very quickly, these are very quick ones. We're going to do them like 5, 6, 7 minutes apiece. I'm going to try to not talk too long. Jack Williamson. Jack Williamson is a cool old writer. He was one of the first writers at Astounding when we've talked about John Campbell's Astounding. I was not a John Campbell Astounding reader. No, I didn't normally like that stuff. I tended to like stuff in the 60s and 70s more. But I did love, if you loved Isaac Asimov's The Foundation trilogy, and some of E. Van Vogt comes out of John Campbell. And one of the writers we've talked about in previous episodes, who I never really read until recently, is Jack Williamson. He lived until he was almost 100. He was one of the oldest science fiction writers alive up until about a dozen years ago. He actually moved to his home. I forget where he lived, in the Midwest, like Montana or something. He went to his home in the Midwest in a covered wagon. He writes about it. And this is that series of best of edition of volumes that the Ballantine and Del Rey Science Fiction did in the early 70s. And these are really worth collecting because they're kind of nicely organized. It's basically the best of Jack Williamson over his whole career. And normally I don't like the best of volumes, as I've told you, but these are really different because they're basically looking retrospective volumes assembled usually by the author themselves. So Williamson helped select most of these stories in here. And he also, at the same time, he wrote a little kind of cool little afterwards to the pieces he wrote. Williamson had a really long, productive career. He starts off writing really kind of strange, over-the-top space opera. Another thing I don't normally like, but I really quite like the stuff I've read of Jack Williamson. He's famous for the Legion of something or other. The Legion of... Anyway, this Future Legion or something. There's 3 or 4 of those volumes, and I got a kick out of one of those. He goes from kind of over-the-top, just sort of space opera, like Non-Stop to Mars, which is where it's some like Elon Musk wannabe thinks Nietzschean superhero goes to Mars and battles a civilization or something and takes over Mars. And it sounds crazy, but it actually it really works narratively. He's famous for With Folded Hands, which is, it's not really about automation, but it can be read as a metaphor of automation and how it kind of ruins people's brains. And I think it holds up. But he wrote through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and even late into the 1980s and 90s, was still writing some interesting work. And some of his late stories in this are a lot of fun too. His later stories, there's a little bit like Sheckley. They're kind of comic stories. There's one where some intergalactic merchant comes to Earth and opens up a toy shop for kids where he sells them nuclear weapons and space launchers and stuff like that. And it works. It sounds crazy, but it works. Williamson was a very smart guy. He went through all sorts of permutations in his life. At one point, he became an academic. He was I want to say, somewhere in Colorado. He was an academic there. He wrote a dissertation, and late in life became a professor. And he talks a little bit about it in the afterwards to this. And he sounds like a really, really likable man. He tended to become an academic. He was an academic not like we often have these days, just writing psychobabble, lit crit bullshit, but seemed to just have an enthusiasm for good writers, not just science fiction writers, but all sorts of writers. So anyway, it reminded me that Jack Williamson, if you want to read this whole series, they did a lot of books. They did C.L. Moore, we've talked about, Henry Kuttner. You can dig these up on eBay or your secondhand bookshop, and I really enjoy having these volumes, especially on writers I don't know too well. It reminded me that last week we lost James E. Gunn. James E. Gunn was a writer who kind of came to prominence in the 50s, I want to say. And I don't have all his books out here. Oh, I didn't mention this. I haven't read this yet, but this is folded hands. I think this is a sequel, The Humanoids. And it's probably Williamson's most famous book. And we'll probably do that in the bathtub soon. James E. Gunn was a writer who had some success in the magazines and publishing a lot of these old Ballantine books. The Joy Makers was his first novel, and a pretty interesting novel. I enjoyed it. And he used to kind of specialize in the fix-up. He would sort of write 3 novellas of about 50 or 60 pages. Then he could sell those to the magazines. They're sort of separate. They have their own stories, but they can be held together as a novel. Actually, we talked a little bit. Asimov's Foundation series was a fix-up. Was a series of novelettes that he wrote that he kind of strung together. This is an interesting book. It's about an idea that there's a company that comes to the world, to America, and starts selling joy. It sells happiness, and it tests people, and it finds out what they want to make them happy, and it makes them physically healthy first to be happy, and then deals with all sorts of psychological imbalances. So that's the first third of it. It's a very good opening. It's not as funny as Sheckley, but it does remind me of Sheckley a lot, which is it's a kind of a what if a social how society might work in a different way. We might talk about dystopias. One of our bathing buddies on the Facebook page has talked about dystopias recently. We might talk a bit more about those. And this would definitely qualify as a dystopia. So what happens when everyone becomes happy? And then the second third of it takes place 50 years later. And then after that, 50 years later on another planet. And how society changes as these new machine-structured ways of becoming happy become implanted in society and culture and in religion. His most famous book was probably The Listeners. I haven't read The Listeners, but I thought I would try to read it in the next few weeks because James Gunn just died at the age of 97. He had a good life. And The Listeners, Carl Sagan called it one of the best books of alien contact. And Carl Sagan's was kind of cool, if you don't know him. So The Listeners is one of his most famous ones. He also wrote a book called The Immortal. And I met him a couple times when I was a kid, James Gunn. He's a very nice man. And The Immortals was turned into a really bad TV series. But it was another one like The Joy Makers. It sort of imagined what would happen if there was a mutant, a person who came along with blood that made people immortal. And if you could pass that blood around and everyone became immortal. And it describes how society changes as a result of this shift. I don't know the witching hour what this is about, but I have this. One of his last books was called Campus. And I just want to talk a little bit about James Gunn and just let you know he existed. He was a very interesting writer. Not the sort of writer you might not know him, but he kind of connected to my mind with Jack Williamson because they were friends. They did collaborate together on at least one novel. And James Gunn went to the University of Kansas, was also an academic, and like Williamson was one of the first science fiction writers to teach in universities and to teach science fiction and to establish libraries for the science fiction, repository of all these great books and writers who were pretty much ignored by most academics. And he started a lot, they have a lot of the important papers are there. I think the Theodore Sturgeon papers are there. And he also helped initiate some of the important awards. I believe they did the John W. Campbell Award and maybe another award at University of Kansas because of basically what James E. Gunn had done there. So a couple of, good writers and kind of, to my mind, the sort of academics that we sort of need more of. They just wanted to kind of preserve and help pass around. The critical term is disseminate. I hate that word. Pass around good writing. Okay? So that's our fast one. We're down to, I hope, 4 more days. Let's hope we get through the next 5 days of these idiots, okay? Take care. Stay safe. Happy bathing. You see some idiot without a mask, just stay away from these idiots, okay? Take care.